Hi friends, hope you are doing fine. I am Dr. Ganguly. Welcome to my channel. So today I am going to discuss 5 PhD myths, and these are myths which are often believed by students, the graduate student population at large, as well as many common people. So let's look at these 5 myths and try to point out what are the problems with each of these myths. Now, the number one myth is that all PhDs are equal, and this is often believed by the general population, is that when a person has a PhD degree, he or she has accomplished a certain level of proficiency, and this proficiency is basically the same for all people who have got the PhD. Now, as somebody who has been in the research field for a long time and has been in various committees which had the task of judging PhD thesis, I will tell you that there is very little consensus among the faculty as to what is a good PhD thesis, though there may be consensus about what is a lower quality PhD thesis. Now, some people would say that if several publications have come out of a thesis in good journals, then that thesis is good. Some people would simply count the number of papers and look at scientometric data such as the impact factor of the journals and so on. Now, there are some people who actually say we need to look at the referee's comments for the thesis, because the thesis is a document which stands on its own merit and we should not bother about the publications which come out of the thesis. And then there are people who say that let's look at the fact that any research monograph came out of the thesis or not, or did the guy write a book from the thesis. So these are some of the facts which are always brought up, and it's always very difficult to come up with a decision as to who has written the best thesis in a certain year in a department. Now, if you think about it from a more abstract perspective, what happens through a PhD thesis is actually the growth of the student in terms of his or her scholarship in the field, capability of doing research and so on. And in reality, it's only time which can tell how good a thesis is or not, because sometimes work done in the thesis can even find its way into textbooks down the road. There are people who have done PhD thesis and they have made some seminal discovery in their PhD thesis. So it's not a question about how many papers are there or how many papers are not there, but certainly papers do reflect some aspect about the thesis quality, but they are not an end in itself. So now let's look at number 2 myth, and that's papers equal to PhD. So there are some people who think that if you write a few papers, you can collate these documents and write a thesis. And this myth is sometimes there in the mind of students who think that they have written 3 or 5 journal papers, and so their supervisor should just graduate them with the PhD thesis. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case in many situations, because the papers may have been disjoint, the papers may not lead to a certain end result. So if the papers all follow a certain linear path, that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, leads to E, then it can lead to a thesis. But sometimes what happens is that people do disparate research problems and then they try to put all this together, and if a thesis is created out of these documents, what happens is that the person who reads the thesis finds that this is a collection of disjoint concepts. The different chapters essentially seem like papers and so on, and sometimes such thesis can even be rejected by the referee. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the number 3 myth is that quantitative PhDs are difficult to do, qualitative PhDs are easy. So here quantitative means in subjects such as science, mathematics, technology subjects, and qualitative could be subjects such as humanities, literature, liberal arts in general. Now, actually I would say the reverse is the case. In quantitative fields, very often the problems are very well defined. A previous PhD student probably left a problem at a certain stage, and the next PhD student can smoothly move on to the next level of the problem. So somebody has done a Monte Carlo simulation based study. The next student can come and use some more efficient methods such as polynomial chaos or stochastic collocation. Now, in humanities, it is much more complex because people have to essentially spend a lot of time figuring out what is a good problem, and there is a lack of consensus in these fields as to what exactly needs to be done as the next problem. So again, these fields are, I can say, more political, and so qualitative PhDs can actually be more difficult and in fact political, because all kind of issues come up in the department and within the community itself as to what's the current belief in the community, say in sociology or such fields. Now, the number 4 myth is that PhD equals hard work. And while doing a PhD entails a lot of hard work, I would say that hard work simply will not produce a PhD. And the reason is that there is a lot of creativity involved in coming up with a good PhD problem and solving it. And this requires you to actually think in a random and somewhat non-linear manner. So a lot of the thinking of a PhD student takes place in random settings. They may be in cafes while drinking coffee or drinking tea. It may be when they are taking a shower, they are watching a movie, they are playing a game or something like that. And very frequently it's the research problem which plays a big part in the thesis coming out. So essentially, if the research problem is something which is relatively fertile, the PhD can be done with much less amount of hard work than if it is a problem which is intractable, in which 10 people have worked and now the next jump is actually very difficult to do. So again, PhD is not going to come only from hard work. There is an aspect of creativity, an aspect of luck, some aspect of serendipity involved in getting a PhD. Now, the number 5th myth which is there is that the advisor essentially controls the PhD granting process. So many students are always upset with their PhD advisor that he or she is not giving them the PhD, though they have done a lot of work, they have marinated for a long time in the department and so on. But the problem is the PhD advisor himself is not sure as to the amount of work which is required to do a PhD, because there are people in the system who may question his decision. So there is always the committee of professors which essentially sits on judgment of the thesis, or your thesis may be sent to some people outside the university. Sometimes these are within your country, sometimes these may be in a foreign country. So all these issues are going to be there. And beyond all this, if a PhD gets negative review, it is also questioned at the Senate level. So this is a set of senior professors in the university who will then look at the thesis. They may form one more committee to go through the thesis, and so this whole Pandora's box is going to be opened at that point. So essentially what the PhD supervisor would like is that the thesis sails through without any problem as far as the committee of professors is concerned, as far as the external examiner are concerned, and therefore he or she is always going to think about one more paper, one more simulation, one more experiment which is going to be required before the PhD is finished. Therefore, in general, the PhD supervisor does not really know when the PhD is going to be finished. He has to function in consensus with various department professors. The fact that there are some publications does guide the process, but remember that these publications all must follow in the same path so that you can link them all to the PhD. So they should not be disjoint or disparate. So this was my take on 5 PhD myths, and now that you know them, you will probably have a better time when you are doing your PhD, or if you are planning to do your PhD. Knowing these myths is going to help you make a final decision. So I will stop this video now. I will see you in a video sometime soon. See you then.